I'm delighted to be here. And the first slide there, you see over the next hour what I'm going to attempt to do. I'm going to do a brief overview of the Gallipoli campaign because there'll be some of you not that familiar. I'm going to explain about the background of the 3 units I'm covering. I'm going to talk about the Brummie connection, partly because I'm sitting here in Birmingham, and also then focus on a couple of days rather than try and cover all of the history of these 3 units. Focus on 4 days, which I've listed there. I'm going to try and touch on the biographies of some of those commemorated on the cathedral windows, and then in all of that, I'm going to attempt a brief summary. This is all my own work, but I'm very grateful to Taco de Bruyne, who has taken some photos, and Chris Finn, who supplied some photos as well. And I'll mention those as we go through. And also, I'm very grateful for those at the Worcester Regiment Museum, Worcester, for giving me access to the war diaries. Okay, so Gallipoli. Many people, when I mention Gallipoli, say, oh, that was the New Zealanders, wasn't it? And yes, of course, 80,000 of them, but 350,000 from the British Empire, and including those from the Worcester area, or serving with the Worcesters in the wider West Midlands, coming from the wider West Midlands and from Birmingham. So the Gallipoli campaign was an attempt to knock Turkey out of the war, the sick man of Europe. You'll see there the map which shows the Gallipoli Peninsula, about the 1/5 of the size of Wales, I believe. And the idea was to force, through naval action alone, the straits of the Dardanelles, bombard Constantinople, and the Turks would give up. It didn't actually happen like that, but it's important to remember that it was meant to be just a naval campaign to begin with. And there is the peninsula itself with the 3 fronts, although this map shows they merged. The Helles front down at the southern tip, the ANZAC front here, and the Suvla front, and the Worcesters, the Worcester battalions, and the Yeomanry that I'm going to mention served in all 3 of these. So I'm quickly going to try and sum up the campaign in 10 pictures. Many of you will know this, and apologies for making any mistakes. The Churchill, who was not solely responsible for the campaign, it had the full support of the cabinet, and they talked about other ways of knocking Turkey out of the war, landing on the Mediterranean coast, for example, of their possessions. But of course, forcing the straits did not work. There were plenty of warships. They were a little old, but they weren't able to clear the mines, nor survive the bombardment from the Turkish guns. And March the 18th, the last naval defeat, is celebrated, of course, in Turkey as rightly a victory. So it's made the decision to land 2 British divisions, the 29th Division in Helles and the Royal Naval Division, and very famous picture, rather grainy picture, but very famous picture, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. Very, very high casualties in that landing, and particularly on V&W Beach, and lost opportunities elsewhere. Of course, the Australians landed further north, a number of Australian and New Zealand divisions, and they quite quickly became hemmed in around ANZAC Cove and surrounded by mountains. surrounded by mountains, or hills rather, and it was always very, very difficult to progress inland. And it then developed into trench deadlock, both on the Helles front and the ANZAC front. You see there, that's almost symbolises the way things work in the Gallipoli Association. There's me asked to put my hat on the rifle to draw the fire, while there's Stephen and Warren sleeping down the side there. But seriously, developed into trench warfare. A lot of attacks by both sides, in the same way on the Western Front, often ill-planned, ill-prepared, not enough artillery, and very, very heavy casualties for little gain. Straight away, the casualties began to build up, but also with disease as well. Particularly dysentery, and perhaps the most famous victim of dysentery, although he recovered, was the future Prime Minister Clement Attlee, serving with a Manchester regiment. So Ian Hamilton, Sir Ian Hamilton, who commanded the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, came up with a pretty good plan, which was to land troops behind the Turks at Suvla Bay. But again, opportunities lost. They were caught the Turks by surprise. Opportunities lost as they didn't press on quickly enough inland, and the Turks quickly took the high ground overlooking Suvla Bay, and a familiar story with the Allied troops having to attack uphill. By then, of course, the two divisions had been supplemented by territorial divisions and by divisions made up of Kitchener volunteers, and by the Yeomanry, who formed into, for example, the 2nd Mountain Division, which we'll speak of later on. One of the young Turkish generals, the Allies continually underestimated the Turks, was an officer called Ataturk, who later became the first premier, the first leader of the new modern Turkey. Mustafa Kemal rather became Kemal Ataturk later on. So both at Suvla, well, not at ANZAC, Suvla, the familiar story, very, very high casualties, often attacking in very, very difficult terrain, not only uphill, but divided by rivers, by streams rather, by valleys, and a lot of brushwood made it very, very difficult coordinating attacks. And a familiar story on the flatter plains of Krithia, and I'll come back to that at a later stage. And a number of offensives which occurred both in ANZAC and at ANZAC and in Helles to support the Suvla landings, resulted in very heavy casualties, but not much gain at all. And then the final offensive on August the 21st was on Scimitar Hill, overlooking the final major offensive, overlooking Suvla Bay, in which the Yeomanry were involved, and again resulted in very little gain, very few, very heavy casualties. And then, of course, there was a period of continued deadlock. Disease affected both sides. And then the winter, and I'll touch on this briefly later on, in the winter, conditions were terrible. Apparently, the internet tells me this is a picture of the Newfoundlanders who had come from present-day Canada, a small number to volunteer, and they're probably the only ones who were used to that sort of weather. But that's quite surprising, very, very difficult weather in November affected both sides, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So eventually it was decided to evacuate, and the Worcesters, the Yeomanry, and the 2 battalions left towards the end of December, early 1916, January 1916, and it was undoubtedly a defeat for the Allies, a victory for the Turks. Lots of perhaps reasons for that, but I think probably we'd all agree the main reason was not allocating enough resources. It could have possibly have achieved, could have been a land attack up the Dardanelles, up the Gallipoli Peninsula rather, seizing Constantinople, but they would have needed vastly more troops and vastly more heavy artillery and so on. And that was the conclusion of the commission. 250,000, approximately 250,000 Allied casualties. Remember, it was supposed to be just a naval attack with a few Marines landed to mop up in various places. About a third of those were from, perhaps even more, from disease. Okay, so apologies for any mistakes I made. Do feel to correct me later on, but that's a very quick summary. Many members of the Gallipoli Association know far more than I do, but for just those of you who are perhaps relatively new to the Gallipoli campaign. Okay, so the regiments we're talking about, the Worcester Regiment, formed in 1881, amalgamation of 2 regiments of foot, recruited from Worcester, but also South Birmingham and the Black Country, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. 3 battalions fought with distinction in the Second Boer War, and in 1914 there were 4, unusually 4 regular battalions and 2 territorial. 1 battalion was involved in 1911 in the crushing of the Llanelli railway strike. The 2nd Worcesters were involved at Gevelet in the First Battle of Ypres, saved the British Empire, as somebody wrote, in October 1914. Regiment expanded to 22 battalions, suffered around 10,000 casualties, serving in every major theatre. Not all of those 22 battalions went abroad. Members of the regiment, the Worcester Regiment, the various battalions, awarded 9 VCs during the war, and the 9th Service Battalion, as I'm going to mention in detail later on, helped put down the Taranto revolt, a mutiny of British troops in December 1918. So the war wasn't over for them in the armistice. The Yeomanry, of course, date back to 1794. They were volunteers. Queen's Own Worcestershire Hussars. They were recruited from the county, but again also from the Black Country and far away as Staffordshire. And we've heard also tonight earlier on as far away from the West Country. The Yeomanry had been involved, many regiments of the Yeomanry had been involved in putting down civil unrest in the early 19th century. They also served in the Boer War in the Imperial Yeomanry and became part of the new territorial force in 1908, based in Worcester itself. And the first we're going to be very focusing on, they continued to fight in the Middle East after Gallipoli, taking part in the charge at Hajj in November 1917, which is still recognised every year by the good people of Worcester. So that map I'll just briefly show you. There, of course, is Worcester. There's Birmingham, where I'm talking from at the moment, but a large number of the volunteers for the regular battalion came from this sort of area, from an urban area, and South Birmingham as well. So Worcester has a big place in the military history of Birmingham, as well as Worcester, the county Worcester, and the more rural areas itself. Worcester is a fantastic place in many ways, but in terms of maintaining the memory of these brave men and women who served in the First World War and the Second World War, it is really very, very good at keeping its heritage alive. The city of Worcester, the cathedral, has a number of windows dedicated to Gallipoli veterans. There's the war memorial outside the cathedral. There's a number of Gallipolians, for want of a better word, mentioned on that memorial. There's the City Museum, which has some of the collection of the old Worcester Regiment museum in there. There, I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to take a photograph of it. That came online from the internet. That's the reserve barracks in Worcester, where the rest of the collection of the Mercian Regiment Museum Worcester is held. And there is, in a park in Worcester, a memorial to the Worcester Regiment, not at Gallipoli, but at Gevelet as well. Never been able to pronounce that, sorry. And the City Museum has got a lot of artifacts about the regiment. It's a great museum, particularly if you have grandchildren. There's loads of them to do, but there's a couple of things: a Turkish medal there, a Turkish razor, and a trench diorama. And there you have the Yeomanry. I'm not sure whether the chap on the left is looking at his mobile phone or as a compass. And there on the right-hand side, in the City Museum in Worcester, is a Turkish sabre. And within the Mercian Regiment Worcester, in the barracks, in the reserve barracks, and I think there may be plans to move the whole collection into new premises, into the city centre, but there's this book which I've used a lot, The Worcester Regiment in the Great War, and I'll mention other books in a moment as we go through, rather, Captain Stack, which is a very, very good book about the Worcester Regiment. And of course, Worcester's a great place. It's got one of the best second-hand charity bookshops in the country, and it's got some of the best I better move on and not have the Gallipoli Association recommend any drinking places in Worcester. So, moving on to the history. The regulars, as I said, the fourth, one on the 4 regular battalions, they're in Burma when the war broke out, and they joined the rest of the incomparable 29th Division forming up in South Warwickshire. And that's one of my favourite pictures. I don't necessarily think these are Worcester soldiers, but this is in Coventry, my hometown. I really love these two children looking over, but of course, more seriously, did these two lads here ever survive the First World War? So the 4th took part in the first landings in Helles on the 25th of April, also took part in the Battle of Krithia Vineyard, 6th of August, and they remained in the peninsula until January 1915. And I'll take a detailed look on what happened on the 25th of April and the 6th of August later on in this talk. The volunteers, the 9th Service Battalion, consisted of volunteers answering Kitchener's call. They became part of the other volunteer battalions, became part of the 13th Western Division with a number of other volunteer battalions. After a period of training, they landed at Helles for their their training in the real warfare in 1915, and July 1915, took part in the offensive on the ANZAC front on the 6th of 11th August 1915. They remained also in the peninsula until January 1916, and I'll be explaining more what happened to them. And the Yeomanry, they was volunteer part-time cavalry. They mobilised in 1914, and virtually all of them volunteered for overseas service, formed part of the 1st Brigade of the 2nd Mountain Division, but without their horses. They arrived in Gallipoli in August. A quarter of the men remained in Egypt to look after the horses. Due to sickness and battle casualties, they were merged with remains of other units to form the 1st South Midlands Regiment. That was after those 2 points are in the wrong order, something I personally call the balaclava of the Dardanelles on the 21st of August 1915. They remained in Gallipoli until the end of October. That's a picture of the Warwickshire Yeomanry. Interesting looking character there. So some Brummies. That's the Hall of Memory in the middle of Birmingham, and there are many names mentioned on there. Of the 100 or so Gallipolians listed there, 25 of them served with those Worcester battalions or regiments. So that shows the connection between Worcester and Birmingham. And of course, a Victoria Cross was won by, well, is it somebody from Birmingham? Because he actually was born in Ladywood, which is in Birmingham, but he lived for most of his life before moving to London in Smethwick. Now, if you know anything about Birmingham politics, people in Smethwick deny that they're part of Birmingham, they're now part of Sandwell. But that's of only interest to those of us living here. So he joined the army in 1909, served with the 21st Lancers as a private soldier in Egypt, so obviously a regular. Outbreak of the war, became an officer with the 4th Worcesters. And there is his, and I won't read it all out, we don't have time for that, but there is his citation. The regiment had been checked, all the officers been put out of action. 2nd Lieutenant James gathered together a body of men, led them forward, put fresh life into the attack. Then later on, he had a party of bomb throwers. He remained alone at the head of the trench, kept the enemy back single-handedly, although exposed to murderous fire. And through all of that, he did survive. He was later wounded in Gallipoli, recovered, served on the Western Front, wounded again. Amazing. Sorry, I keep pressing page down. It's very close here. He was awarded the Military Cross in 1917, retired from the army in 1930, died in 1958. There's some story that he'd become a recluse, but his wife had died and he was an artist, so he spent most of his time painting on his own. He's buried at Kensal Green Cemetery, as I said. Medals sold for 211,725, and that's a record at the time. And they're displayed at Maryborough, Queensland in Australia. So it's quite interesting they've ended up in Australia. But there's a copy of them in the City of Worcester Museum with a picture there. So that's the Worcester VC, and he came, that's not to take anything away from Worcester, of course, but he actually came from the Birmingham conurbation, so to speak. One person I'm particularly keen on is Lieutenant Douglas Greenaway. He lived very close to where I'm broadcasting from, Greenhill Road in Moseley, attended Oundle School in Northampton. He joined the Birmingham Pals as a private soldier, but was soon commissioned, and by the time of Gallipoli had been transferred to the 4th Worcesters. And on the night of 17th of October, he was involved in a wiring party. The party was spotted and a number were wounded by enemy fire. Douglas sent out with 2 of his men to bring them in. Great bravery. He dragged a couple of them to safety just to reach the 3rd man when he was shot dead. And his body was later recovered, and he's staggeringly, he'd been attached to the battalion for only 1 week, and he was 24. He's buried in ANZAC Cemetery. And why am I so keen in his story? Because he's remembered in the church here in Moseley in Birmingham, and it's my investigation into him that led me to a much greater interest in Gallipoli and joining the Gallipoli Association all those many years ago, and the rest is history, as they speak. And there, thanks to Taco Bruin, is a picture of his grave here, or believed to be, it's not actually his grave, of course, but believed to be buried in the cemetery. Second Lieutenant Douglas Greenaway died aged 24. Their glories shall not be blotted out. Very apt there. So, mentioning another Brummie, I'm going to mention a lot of other Worcester people, but this is one that served with the Yeomanry, and he lived for a time in Ascot Road. Again, very interested in him because before living in this current house, I lived in Ascot Road. He attended King Edward's High School and then got a job working for a brass founding company, and he joined the Worcester Yeomanry. Remember, it'd be part-time in 1908, became a signal sergeant. He landed with the regiment on 18th of August 1915 and would have taken part in the attack on Scimitar Hill, which went so badly, and I'll talk about that later on. He was then went to Egypt, and he was escorting a group of Royal Engineers on a well-digging operation, absolutely vital, of course, to the Middle Eastern campaign. They're attacked by a large force of Turkish soldiers, and many were killed or wounded. And his grave has been lost, but is commemorated in the Jerusalem Memorial, a mile north of the city walls. And there's a picture, allegedly, I've got it from the internet, so I always have to say allegedly, of the Worcester Yeomanry in the desert, not in Gallipoli, but in Egypt, I believe. And the church I now go to, I used to go to St. Mary's Church, I now go to All Saints Church in King's Heath. That has one Worcester there. Russell, his last name is Russell, killed in action 6th of August 1915. His body never recovered, commemorated on the Helles Memorial, and he lives very close to where I'm broadcasting there. But 15 other names were Worcesters out of the 122. But they didn't serve in Gallipoli, and includes the family of Barbara Cartland. Barbara Cartland, whose family well known in this area. So, on to the Worcesters. Now, I mentioned the Stack book, but for those of you joining us for the first time or want to learn more about Gallipoli, a really good starting point, this excellent book, that is Gallipoli by Peter Hart. I don't earn any commission on recommended books because I'm going to recommend a couple of others later on. The 4th Worcesters, as I said, were a regular battalion, part of the 29th Division. On the 25th of April 1915, landed at V Beach, and they were meant to land on V Beach on at Helles. They had a strength of 26 officers, 931 of the ranks, so a big battalion, and they transferred the boat to the boats around 10 o'clock. But some of the boats already damaged by enemy fire and covered in blood, and it must have been really quite daunting for them to climb into boats that were splattered with blood and even worse. And as they neared the beach, rather like Saving Private Ryan, they saw the devastation ahead of them, and some of the ex-company clambered onto the lighters, led by Brigadier General Napier. He was soon killed, and they could only seek cover on the lighters until nightfall, and the others sheltered alongside the River Clyde. And around 10:20, only 20 minutes later, the decision was made to transfer the other companies to W Beach. And there's a really graphic picture, and I believe that Stephen Chambers has the original of this, and there's men desperately sheltering there from Turkish fire, and there's the living on that side, and over here the casualties on the lighters. And here's a picture, not quite as graphic, but you see the men coming down here on the planks, made of planks across the wooden boats, but the rest of the Worcesters came round this way and landed on W Beach because the officer concerned judged the fire to be just too great. So the 4 companies landed at 12 o'clock. They followed up the Lancashire Fusiliers. Remember, the Lancashire Fusiliers landed at that beach once 6 VCs before breakfast. They moved out inland. They attacked 2 Turkish redoubts on Hill 138. I'll show you a map there. After being held up by enemy wire, they captured both, and they went on to seize a castle on, excuse my pronunciation, Googly Barber. Neither the castle nor the hill are actually on the maps, and that was a real problem for them. The maps, better than the urban myth that's perpetuated. They had no maps, but they didn't have enough detail there. And there's again a graphic picture of the Worcesters. That's from the stack book. The Worcesters getting through the wire to attack. They came under fire from Hill 141. Next day they cleared the enemy trenches above V Beach, and next day advanced towards Krithia. Krithia was an objective of the first day. It was never captured, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And they faced heavy resistance, heavy counterattacks, but by the 28th of April, they'd suffered 317 casualties. And that's from a map from the stack book. That's where the River Clyde was. They would come round here, and then there's the redoubt, there's Hill 138, there's the castle or the fort, and by the nightfall they had got to there. A tremendous achievement, and helped resist the pressure on V Beach and make it a success. From the war diaries, quite graphic war diaries, owing to the beach being swept by fire, the rest of the battalion landed on W Beach. The whole of Hill 138 was well protected by the wire entanglements. You've seen the picture there. Captain Ray decided to push through at all costs, incredibly brave. I think he was seriously wounded. Hill 141 stormed at 2:20 p.m. And incredible, you think that all happened in one day. And during the night of the 25th and 22nd, the enemy repeatedly attempted to retake the trenches, but were repulsed. I'm always fascinated by war diaries and how matter of fact they often are. Sometimes not always, but how matter of fact they are. But then they suffered lots of casualties. They went on to the 6th of August took part in Krithia Vineyard. It's a diversionary attack. I mentioned the Suvla attack earlier. The Suvla landings rather earlier. It was a diversionary attack to take to draw the enemy away from Suvla. Strange plan. Due to the shortage of artillery, the attack was split into 2 parts. The 88th Brigade attacking in the afternoon, while the 42nd East Lancashire Division would attack the next morning. Objective for the Worcesters was Trench H13. The area they had to cross had no cover. It's now known as Worcester Flats. They were facing 4 Ottoman divisions, 3 were fresh, and there were 2 more divisions in reserve. So talk about a hopeless task there. And if you want to find out more about this battle, incredibly detailed book, I've no hesitation recommending it. I've used it a great deal many times by our very own Stephen Chambers. And there's the trench that where the Worcesters were attacking towards Krithia there. And here's a map from the stat book. There's the 4th Worcesters. There is H13. Looks not a great deal of not a great distance. Also, for anybody who wants to find out about their ancestors' battalions or regiments, this brilliant book by Ray Westlake, British Regiments at Gallipoli. So the attack began at 3:50, casualties very heavy. Only a small number of unwounded men, led by a sergeant, reached the enemy trenches. The attack petered out. Scouts sent out at night to see whether any Worcesters in H13, they'd all been killed and captured. During the morning of 7th of August, the 42nd Division attacked on the right. They failed to break through, and they had some success, but they're forced back by counterattacks. And I was struggling to find pictures. I don't like that one. I know it's a staged picture, and the Turks counterattacked repeatedly, and fighting continued until the 13th of August. 768 casualties on the 6th of August, the highest of any unit in one day during the campaign, some 93%. The 18th Brigade ceased to be an effective unit. And Stephen can comment later on. I'm delighted he's here. Stephen Chambers points out that no Turkish units were moved from the Suvla front. It should have been there. Two accounts which I found, and they're really graphic. I'll just read them out. It was not fit for a fly to get out of the trenches, for the shot and shell were flying everywhere, knocking the sandbags off the top of the trenches, which we had to mount to get at the Turks. When we started, we could see men falling like rain. On August the 6th, about 3:30 p.m, we went into the firing line, had to charge straight away, only having time to fix bayonets. We had to charge about 350 yards. Never shall I forget that dreadful time, and also the bullets whistling around us. But I succeeded in reaching the Turks' trenches without a scratch. Amazingly, nearly all my pals were either killed or wounded. And there it is, Worcester Flats. Now, that's one of these pictures is provided by Stephen. One is by Taco, if he's here. And unfortunately, I can't remember which one is which, but they both really sum up what they are attacking over. Now, to go into attack against trenches with no cover whatsoever, it's not surprising the casualties they suffered. And Taco actually found a bullet while he was out there with the rest of the party from the Dutch Western Front Association, a cartridge rather. So perhaps it was belonged to one of the Worcesters. And there's in the City Museum the medals of Lieutenant Colonel J.O. Nelson, OBE. He had an auspicious career, but you notice there he was severely wounded at the Battle of Krithia. And the war diary, batteries shelled H13 for the whole morning. Breaches gradually appeared in the enemy parapet, rather optimistic there. The first line thinned by machine gun fire. I won't read the rest of that. Detached parties of the first and second line entered the enemy's trenches. At dark, an officer's patrol went out to locate the sections of H13 occupied by our men, but after 1 hour's thorough reconnaissance, were convinced the whole trench was now in the hands of the Turks. So, a depressingly familiar story for the 4th Battalion. The 9th Battalion on the 10th of August, they were involved in a selective decisive attack on Seri Bar. I'll show you the map, Seri Bar. They'd actually been moved to the ANZAC front. I thought the 13th Division was divided up, which is never a good idea, after a period of settling in at Helles. I'll mention a little bit about that in a moment. The first stage of the attack on Seri Bar was the attack on Chunuk Bair, and the 29th Brigade launched a flanking attack along the coast, supported by naval gunfire. The plan was to turn right at Agil Dare, which is a long sort of dry watercourse, and move uphill. When the attack began, the 9th Worcesters were in reserve. They were in reserve. Again, a brilliant book by Stephen Chambers explains a lot about this. And this is a map which shows the route taken by the 9th Worcesters during this period from 6th of August to around about, they got around about here, from to the 10th of August. March, very difficult, with lots of confusion and mixing up of units. The assaulting forces suffered heavy casualties. They even struggled to get through the trenches with a mass of wounded and various other things. They remained in the area of Agildere. Just go back. Agildere is there. Remained in the area of Agildere for 3 days, at one time suffering casualties from friendly naval fire. And they were involved in the attack on Hill Q, and they took over trenches near the farm. And there's the farm, and there's Hill Q. So they managed to get as far as here. But then they were due to attack on the 9th. This was postponed. They suffered casualties from Turkish shellfire and sniping, big problem, particularly amongst officers. At dawn on the 10th, they were called to the front line to help resist Turkish attacks organised by Mustafa Kemal. Casualties very heavy, including Lieutenant Colonel Nunn. And Chris Finney, who's here, is a descendant, a relative of Lieutenant Colonel Nunn, Major Boyd Noss, and Captain Ralph. I mention those because they're mentioned on the windows of Worcester Cathedral. Sorry, I've repeated that bit there. Apologies for that. They received about 100 reinforcements and then took part in the attacks on Kabakkoy and Hill 60. Once again, heavy casualties, and the battalion was reduced to 200 effectives. It was merged into a composite battalion with the 7th Gloucesters, and that's the terrain. I mentioned the difficulties of the terrain, the hills, the cuts, the valleys, the dares, and the brush, which made it very, very difficult attacking. So, looking at the 9th Battalion War Diary, and I just jump back to the 16th of July to Cape Helles. Battalion took over J&H trenches. I won't show you where they were. And this was to get them, they were merged with the 29th Division, get them familiar. Remember, these were young volunteers, their first taste of action, nothing to record. But then 2nd Lieutenant Bourne was killed by enemy machine gun fire, which it was extinguishing a scrub fire, a fire in the scrub. Lieutenant C.J. True is mortally wounded, being bayoneted by an excited sentry of another regiment. Very sad, very sad. And then on to the diary. The battalion on the 9th of August, remember they've been plodding along. That's not to criticise them, plodding along since the 6th of August. They arrived at the Dare just before dawn. Passage very narrow, entirely blocked by mules, native drivers. Headway very slow. No officer appeared to be there to direct traffic. Followed a great deal of moving forwards, backwards, and long halts. Very familiar story in this territory. If you read Stephen's books, it happens time and time again. And I said matter of fact, the author of the War Diary said, the position of the battalion was bad. Heavy rifle fire was being kept up continuously from higher ridges on each flank and in front. And then on the 10th of August, that date I've focused on, but you can't understand 10th of August without knowing a little bit of the build-up. The British attack time for 4:30 was a failure. They also got, I mentioned, friendly fire, bombarded by naval guns. A substantial reinforcement was expected. They never arrived. They having got lost. And the Turks, just before dawn, the Turks attacked all along the front. I mentioned the high ground. They advanced supported by heavy rifle fire, machine gun fire from the high ground. And they also employed big spherical bombs of unusual size, which they rolled down the slopes into the members of the 9th Battalion, causing heavy casualties. A story of confusion, heavy casualties, and very, very little achieved. very little achieved. And I've just included from the, I've only picked it from the 9th Battalion War Diaries, November the 25th and 26th. A parapet collapses such suddenness due to the heavy rain that many rifles, kits and ammunition were buried. On the rain ceasing, the men were put on to work and kept at it till dawn. Really tough conditions, really tough work. 5 a.m. a blizzard set in, snow fell all day and a very cold wind was blowing, produced cases of frostbite and trench feet as all the men were soaking wet from the flood. And I've talked in detail about that because at the end of this section, it says the spirit of the men is splendid. And remember, these were young volunteers. Their first action, they'd only been in the British Army in the 9th Worcesters for a matter of months. The spirit of the men, despite the terrible casualties on the 10th of August and the confusion and the getting lost and so on, and then these the disease, dysentery over the later summer, these terrible conditions in November, the spirit of the men is splendid. And the cathedral windows, there's the memorial I mentioned, George William Rolfe, captain. He was attached to the 9th Battalion. Major Ernest William Boyd Moss attached to the 9th Battalion. There's that date, which should be etched in Worcester's history, 10th August the 10th, 1915. And then Lieutenant Colonel Nunn, he was also killed at that time, and we have included a photograph of him. And it's very moving, these windows in Worcester Cathedral. And this is photos from Chris Finn of he was fortunate to visit his relative's grave, Lieutenant Colonel Nunn there. I have fought a good fight. Well, that's absolutely right and properly says that, but all of them had fought a good fight in very difficult circumstances. And the Australian War Memorial, online War Memorial, has a shoulder tab of the 9th Worcesters there. Very interesting, and it really, I think it's really quite appropriate that a Worcester item has made it to this online war memorial, Australian War Memorial, because the 9th were fighting with the ANZACs. So, coming to the last one, 21st of August, the Yeomanry at the Salt Flats. 2nd Mountain Division, I mentioned the attack on Scimitar Hill, they were in reserve. Hamilton's last major offensive, but it was actually to straighten the line across Suvla to enable it to be held by less men. Little artillery support, the attack was badly planned and coordinated. The attack faltered, and later in the morning they were called to support the attack. The Allied lines were a distance away, so they had to cross the Salt Flats, not to get to the Turkish lines, but to get to the Allied lines. They were easily spotted by Turkish artillery, who laid down very heavy fire. Many of the units were decimated, the 2nd Mountain Division, before they reached the start line, including the one I'm particularly interested in, the Worcester Yeomanry, suffered terrible casualties. And that's where they started from. They crossed the Salt Lake. They were supposed to be joining the failed attack in Scimitar Hill. Many of them only got as far as Chocolate Hill, but very, very heavy casualties, as they were clearly visible from the Turks up here and the Turkish, excuse me, and the Turkish artillery. And fortunately, the CO of the Worcester Yeomanry ordered the men to go in extended order. And that's a picture which shows, I doubt whether it actually shows them, but shows soldiers crossing in more extended order, because the 1st Yeomanry, the Warwickshire Yeomanry, went almost in parade order. But casualties were so severe that the regiment was merged with others. They continued in the trenches until October, when they evacuated, returning to Egypt by the end of the year, and involved in the charge at Hudge. And that's what the Turks would have seen. They'd have seen the Yeomanry, the 2nd Mountain Division. This is why I have used the term Balaclava of the Dardanelles, crossing this salt flat, some in extended order, but some in parade order. And for all of them, it was their first action. And all of the officers who were soon killed, it was their first action. And there's a picture of what they found as they got to Chocolate Hill. And we have, obviously, there were a great variety in the backgrounds of the Yeomanry. Jack Littleton, who was the eldest son of 8th Viscount Cobham of Hadley Hall, is still there. He wrote a letter, and these letters, obviously, there's some really grim ones who made it, the Warwickshire Yeomanry, made it into the press. But best beloved, just a scribble to say, I am well. And down the bottom, they stood, that's his men, they stood a real bad dusting under shrapnel, as well as the best disciplined soldiers, all my love. So the men were perfectly splendid. And again, the details in Suvla, and that shows, I don't think it's the Worcester Yeomanry starting off. These are the ones that started off in parade order, providing such a target. And we have a Victor Godridge, who recorded the event. Shrapnel fell like hail, rifle fire like made gaps in our ranks. It was not a pleasant feeling to see a man dropping ahead of you, knowing that you would soon be amongst it. The 2 miles or so we marched seemed the longest that I've ever travelled. He's not kidding, is he? 2 miles getting us from there where they started only to the British lines under heavy fire. And that picture, of course, shows an ambulance crew collecting some of the casualties at the end. And I said that I'd mention some of the other memorials in the cathedral. Lawrence Barnard Carlton, not everybody in Worcester or mentioned in the Worcester Cathedral served in the Worcesters, Royal Army Medical Corps, again killed August the 10th, 1915, and in memory of Lieutenant Colonel Winnington, Worcestershire Regiment, but he was actually attached to the Northamptonshire Regiment. He died of wounds in Palestine, but he served in Gallipoli. And I'm going to finish with I've got plenty of other things I could tell you about, but I'm going to finish this with this one, so there's plenty of time for questions and so on. We talked about members of the Worcester Regiment being Brummies. That's not to take away at all from those who were lived out in the country, lived in the city of Worcester at all. It's just explaining a little bit about the demographic. But of course, some of the Worcesters were actually some of the ANZACs rather came from Worcester, including Leslie Choules. They've given his family history there, rather lengthy family history, but Leslie Choules served with the Australian Imperial Force, and he was the last one, the last surviving member of the Australian infantry when he died, aged over 100, died quite recently, and he was from Worcester. And that, to me, sums up the contribution of the county and the urban areas made to the Gallipoli campaign, and also to the First World War in general. I did say I was going to mention a summary, use a summary, but we ran out of time, so I'll leave it with that picture of that fine Worcestershire man there. Okay, that's it, folks.